A mysterious spring appears overnight on a drought-stricken farm, healing every plant and animal that drinks from it. But as word of its miraculous powers spreads, dark figures begin lurking in the shadows, forcing the farmer to make a decision that leaves him shaking with fear. Michael stood frozen at the edge of his cornfield, staring at something that shouldn't exist. There, in the middle of Montana's worst drought in 50 years, a small spring bubbled up from the cracked earth. The water seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly blue glow, even under the harsh afternoon sun. He blinked hard, rubbing his eyes with weathered hands, convinced his mind was playing tricks on him. This section of his field had been bone-dry just yesterday, when he'd walked through checking the dying crops. The mysterious spring wasn't large, maybe 3 feet across, but it definitely hadn't been there before. The water had a strange, almost luminescent quality to it, like liquid moonlight flowing up from deep within the earth. Small ripples danced across its surface, despite the absence of any wind. Michael took a cautious step closer, his boots crunching on the parched soil. That's when he noticed something even more impossible. The withered cornstalks nearest to the spring were changing. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, but as he watched, a yellowed stalk suddenly straightened, its leaves unfurling and turning a vibrant shade of green before his eyes. The transformation spread outward like a wave, dead plants coming back to life wherever the spring's water had seeped into the ground. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he knelt down beside the spring. The air around it felt different, cooler, somehow charged with energy. A gentle mist rose from the water's surface, carrying a sweet, clean scent he'd never encountered before. It reminded him of rain, but also of something else. Something ancient and powerful. Looking closer, he noticed tiny sparkles of light dancing just beneath the water's surface, like stars reflected in a midnight pool. He reached out a trembling hand, hesitating just inches above the water. Part of him wanted to touch it, to confirm this miracle was real. But another part of him, the cautious farmer who'd survived 3 generations of hardship on this land, held back. A movement caught his eye. A half-dead grasshopper had landed near the spring's edge. As he watched, it dipped its head to the water. The instant it drank, its dull brown color transformed into a vibrant green, its movements becoming sprightly and energetic. The insect leaped away with renewed vigor, leaving Michael slack-jawed in amazement. Without thinking, he pulled out his phone to record what was happening, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold it steady. The video would be blurry, but he needed some kind of proof. As he filmed, more insects and even a few small birds began gathering around the spring, each one transformed by contact with the mysterious water. His mind raced with possibilities. If this water could revive dead plants and restore life to weakened creatures, what else might it do? Could it save his failing farm? Could it help others? The implications were staggering, but with those thoughts came others, darker ones. Who else might want this water if they knew about it? What would they do to get it? A chill ran down his spine, despite the afternoon heat. He quickly stopped recording and pocketed his phone. Looking around nervously, he realized how exposed he was standing in the middle of his field. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away, but suddenly the open space felt vulnerable. He needed time to think, to figure out what to do. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the rejuvenated patch of cornfield, Michael made his way back to his truck. He cast one last look at the spring, its water now glowing even more brilliantly in the fading light. The transformed area around it stood out like an emerald island in a sea of brown, dying crops. What he didn't know then, couldn't have known, was that this discovery would not only transform his failing farm, but also make him the target of forces far more dangerous than any drought. As he drove home that evening, the first pair of mysterious headlights was already turning onto the dusty road leading to his property, drawn by rumors of something miraculous occurring in this remote corner of Montana. Michael Clayton's story wasn't just about a struggling farmer. It was about 3 generations of Clayton men who had poured their hearts and souls into this piece of Montana soil. His grandfather had purchased these 1,000 acres back in 1947, returning from World War II with nothing but determination and a dream. Through sheer grit and countless sleepless nights, he'd transformed the wild land into one of the most productive farms in Madison County. The old farmhouse still stood as a testament to those early days, its weathered wooden walls holding memories of better times. Michael had grown up listening to stories of how his grandfather and father had survived dust storms, economic downturns, and everything else Mother Nature could throw at them. The Claytons were survivors. It was in their blood. But the challenges Michael faced now were different, more devastating than anything his ancestors had encountered. Climate change had hit Montana hard over the past decade, turning once predictable weather patterns into a cruel lottery. The current drought, stretching into its 3rd year, was the worst anyone could remember. The soil that had once been rich and dark now crumbled like ash between his fingers. Last season, he'd lost 60% of his corn crop. The year before that, it was 70%. The numbers in his ledger had turned an alarming shade of red, and the bank's patience was wearing thinner than the topsoil. Just last week, Sarah Martinez, his loan officer, had visited the farm. Her normally friendly demeanor had been replaced with professional detachment as she explained that without a miracle, the bank would have to foreclose by the end of the harvest season. "Your father was always so careful with his finances," she'd said, shuffling through papers that documented the farm's decline. "He never missed a payment." The unspoken comparison hung heavy in the air. Michael had wanted to explain that his father hadn't faced summers where the thermometer hit 110 degrees for weeks on end, or winters so warm that the wheat never went dormant. He wanted to tell her about the new pests moving north, the rising cost of drought-resistant seeds, and the falling water table that made irrigation increasingly expensive. But he'd remained silent. Excuses wouldn't save his farm. The weight of failure pressed down on him every morning as he walked through his dying fields. His wife Emma, who taught at the local high school, had started picking up extra summer school classes to help make ends meet. Their teenage daughter Lisa had quietly given up her dream of attending college out of state, knowing the family couldn't afford it. The guilt of letting them down gnawed at him constantly. Even his father's old tractor, which had faithfully plowed these fields for 4 decades, seemed to be giving up. It sat in the barn now, its engine seized up from the dust storms that had become increasingly common. Michael couldn't afford to repair it, much less replace it. Instead, he'd been forced to contract with neighboring farms for equipment use, adding to his mounting debts. The local farming community, once tight-knit and supportive, had begun to fray as more families sold out to large agricultural corporations. The Hendersons, who'd farmed the adjacent property for as long as Michael could remember, had sold their land last spring. Now their fields were managed by computers and GPS-guided machinery, operated by workers who drove in from the city and never stayed long enough to learn the land's rhythms. Michael's own children barely remembered the community barbecues and harvest festivals that had once marked the passing of seasons. The old barn where neighbors had gathered to help each other through tough times now stood empty, its red paint peeling in the relentless sun. Sometimes, late at night, Michael would sit on his porch and try to imagine what his grandfather would say about how things had changed. The only person who seemed to truly understand was old Joe Whitecloud, whose family had lived on this land long before any European settlers arrived. Joe still kept a small herb garden on his property at the edge of the reservation, using traditional methods passed down through generations. He'd stopped by the farm last month, his ancient pickup truck kicking up dust on the gravel road. The "A Land Remembers" Joe had said cryptically, studying the withered cornfields with eyes that had seen over 8 decades of changes. When the time comes, it knows how to heal itself. Michael had nodded politely, but privately wondered if the old man was losing his grip on reality. Now, standing at the edge of that impossible spring, Joe's words echoed in his mind with new significance. Looking back at his farmhouse, Michael could see Emma's car pulling into the driveway. She'd be wondering why he wasn't in for dinner yet. How could he explain what he'd found? Would she believe him? Would anyone? The weight of the discovery pressed down on him like a physical burden. This wasn't just about saving his farm anymore. It felt bigger than that, more important somehow. The sun had almost disappeared behind the mountains now, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. A cool evening breeze stirred the newly revived corn plants around the spring, making them whisper secrets he couldn't quite understand. In the growing darkness, the water's ethereal glow seemed even more pronounced, casting blue-white light in a gentle halo. Tomorrow, he would have to make decisions that would affect not just his family's future, but perhaps the future of this entire valley. For now, though, he simply stood and watched as the first stars appeared above his transformed field, wondering if his grandfather had ever faced a moment quite like this one. As Michael walked into his farmhouse that evening, the weight of his discovery made each step feel like he was wading through mud. Emma was at the kitchen table, grading papers from her summer school classes, while their daughter Lisa sat doing homework. Both looked up as he entered, immediately noticing something was different about him. "Dad, you look like you've seen a ghost," Lisa said, putting down her physics textbook. "Are you okay?" Emma stood up, concern etched on her face. "Michael, what's wrong?" She knew every line of her husband's face after 20 years of marriage, could read the tension in his shoulders like a familiar book. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. How could he explain what he'd seen without sounding completely insane? The phone in his pocket felt heavy with the video evidence, but even that seemed inadequate to describe the miracle he'd witnessed. "I need to show you both something," he finally said, his voice hoarse, "but you have to promise to keep it absolutely secret, at least for now." Emma and Lisa exchanged worried glances. The last time Michael had looked this serious was when he'd told them about the bank's foreclosure warning. They followed him onto the back porch, where he pulled out his phone and played the shaky video of the spring. It just appeared today?" Emma asked, squinting at the glowing water on the small screen. "And you're saying it brought dead plants back to life?" "I know how it sounds," Michael replied, running a hand through his graying hair. "But I saw it with my own eyes. The corn around it, it's green again, living, and not just the plants. Every creature that drinks from it seems to be rejuvenated somehow." Lisa's eyes were wide with excitement. "Dad, do you know what this means? This could save the farm. We have to tell someone, scientists maybe, or—" "No!" The force of Michael's response made both women jump. He lowered his voice, glancing nervously at the windows. "We can't tell anyone, not yet. Think about what would happen if word got out about water that can heal anything. The implications hung heavy in the air. Government agencies would swoop in. Pharmaceutical companies would try to claim it. The media would turn their quiet farm into a circus. And those were just the legal entities they'd have to worry about. But we can't just keep it secret forever," Emma said softly, always the voice of reason. "If this water really has healing properties, don't we have a responsibility to share it? Think of all the people it could help." Michael walked to the porch railing, staring out at his fields silvered by moonlight. The spring's glow was visible even from here, a subtle blue luminescence rising from the corn. As he watched, a deer emerged from the shadows, making its way cautiously toward the water. "I've been thinking about it non-stop," he said. "If we tell the wrong people, this gift could become a curse. But if we tell no one, he trailed off, remembering how it felt to watch dead plants spring back to life. We need time to understand what we're dealing with, to figure out the right way to handle this. A coyote's howl echoed across the fields, making them all start. But it wasn't the coyote that made Michael's blood run cold. It was the flash of headlights turning onto their access road, moving slowly, as if whoever was driving was searching for something. "Get inside," he said sharply, ushering his family through the door, "and stay away from the windows." They watched from behind the curtains as a black SUV with tinted windows drove slowly past their house. It continued down the road that led to the back fields, toward the spring. Michael's hands clenched into fists. Somehow word had already gotten out. "What are we going to do?" Lisa whispered, clutching her mother's arm. Michael took a deep breath, knowing the next few minutes would shape everything that followed. They had three choices. They could call the authorities and let them handle whatever was coming. They could try to hide the spring's existence and hope it wouldn't be discovered, or they could take a more active role in protecting it. The SUV's headlights had stopped moving. Whoever was out there had reached the cornfield. "Emma, call Joe White Cloud," Michael said finally. "If anyone knows how to handle something like this, it's him. Lisa, get my grandfather's old journals from the attic. There might be something in there about the land's history that could help us understand what we're dealing with." As his family rushed to follow his instructions, Michael retrieved the old shotgun from above the fireplace. He hadn't fired it in years, but its weight felt comforting in his hands. Loading it with trembling fingers, he remembered his grandfather's words. "Sometimes the land chooses you for a purpose bigger than yourself." Through the window, he could see more headlights approaching from the distance. Whatever force had created that spring had chosen his land, his family. Now he had to decide. Would they become its guardians or its exploiters? Would they share its gift with the world or protect it from those who would abuse it? The clock on the wall struck 9, each chime seeming to echo with the weight of destiny. Michael checked the shotgun one last time and headed for the door. Sometimes the hardest choices aren't between right and wrong, but between different kinds of right. Tonight, he would have to make that choice. The sound of tires crunching on gravel faded into the darkness as the mysterious SUV finally departed around midnight. Michael had spent hours hiding in the shadows of his barn, watching as the vehicle's occupants, 2 men in dark suits, searched his back fields with flashlights. They'd come close to the spring, but by some miracle had missed it among the newly revitalized cornstalks. As soon as the SUV's taillights disappeared, Michael sprinted back to the house where Emma and Lisa were waiting anxiously. Joe White Cloud's ancient pickup truck was parked behind the barn, hidden from the road. The old man himself sat at their kitchen table, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. "They'll be back," Joe said simply, his dark eyes fixed on something distant. "The land's magic always draws them. It has happened before." Michael sank into a chair, the shotgun still clutched in his hands. "What do you mean, happened before? You know something about this spring?" Joe nodded slowly, reaching into his jacket to pull out a leather pouch worn smooth with age. "My grandfather's grandfather knew of such waters. They appear in times of great need, when the balance must be restored." He opened the pouch, revealing a handful of small crystal stones that seemed to pulse with the same ethereal blue light as the spring. These were gathered from the last such spring, nearly 100 years ago. Emma leaned forward, her teachers, curiosity evident. "So this has happened in this area before. What happened to the last spring?" "It vanished," Joe replied, "once its purpose was fulfilled, but not before healing many and bringing great changes. The stories say it lasted through 1 full moon cycle." Michael checked the calendar hanging on the wall. The next full moon was in 28 days. If Joe was right, they had less than a month to figure out what to do with this miracle. "We need to protect it," Lisa said firmly, her teenage determination shining through. "But we also need to understand it. Dad, what if I set up my science equipment near the spring? I could take samples, run tests." "No," Joe interrupted, more sharply than his usual gentle manner. "The water must not be removed from its source. Its power lives in the connection to the land. Break that connection, and you break its purpose." Michael ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "Then we need a plan. Those men tonight, they won't be the last. Someone must have seen something, or maybe there are satellites that detected the change in vegetation. Either way, we need to hide it." For the next few hours, they worked on a strategy. Emma suggested using the remaining healthy corn as camouflage, transplanting it to create a natural barrier around the spring. Lisa, with her knowledge of the farm's irrigation system, proposed rerouting some of the existing pipes to make it appear as though the thriving vegetation was simply the result of better water distribution. As dawn approached, Michael and Joe made their way back to the spring. The morning mist seemed to dance around it, creating an otherworldly scene in the early light. Working quickly, they began implementing their plans. Joe placed his crystals in a circle around the spring, murmuring words in his native language that Michael couldn't understand. When he finished, the water's glow seemed to pulse in response, then dim slightly, becoming less noticeable. "The old ways, remember," Joe said softly. "The crystals will help shield its power from those who would misuse it." Throughout the day, they worked tirelessly. Michael used his tractor to carefully relocate healthy corn stalks, creating a natural screen around the spring. Lisa and Emma mapped out a convincing pattern of irrigation pipes, making sure to document everything in case anyone came asking questions. But as they worked, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Twice he spotted drones flying high overhead. By mid-afternoon, 3 different vehicles had driven slowly past the farm, their occupants trying to appear casual but failing. "We need a cover story," Emma realized, as they took a brief break in the barn. "Something to explain the sudden improvement. In this section of the field, I might have an idea," Lisa said, pulling up something on her phone. "There's this new experimental fertilizer being tested in the region. What if we got some empty bags and scattered them around? Make it look like we're part of the trial program." Michael nodded slowly. It was a good idea, simple but believable. They spent the rest of the day creating a paper trail, careful to make it look authentic but not too perfect. As the sun set on their first full day of protecting the spring, Michael stood at the edge of his transformed field. The corn that had been dead yesterday now stood tall and healthy, a testament to the water's power. But it was more than just the plants. There was something different about the air itself, a feeling of vitality that seemed to pulse from the ground. A hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing across the valley. Michael watched as it swooped down to drink from the spring, its feathers taking on a glossy sheen as the water touched them. The bird rose again, its flight somehow more graceful than before. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Joe's voice came from behind him. "But beauty like this comes with responsibility. The real test is still to come." Michael turned to ask what he meant, but the old man was already walking away, his figure merging with the evening shadows. In the distance, another set of unfamiliar headlights turned onto the road leading to their farm. The race to protect their miracle had begun. The next few days brought a parade of unwanted visitors. First came the agricultural inspectors, their credentials perfect, but their questions oddly specific about any unusual water sources on the property. Michael stuck to their cover story about the experimental fertilizer trial, watching their faces carefully for any sign they didn't believe him. Then came the scientists, 3 different groups in as many days. They arrived in university vehicles, armed with sophisticated equipment and documentation, requesting access to study the anomalous vegetation growth patterns their satellites had detected. Emma handled these visits, her experience as a teacher helping her redirect their interest with technical discussions about irrigation techniques and soil composition. But it was the third type of visitor that worried Michael the most. They came at night, always in pairs, always in black SUVs with tinted windows and no license plates. They never approached the house directly, instead parking on the access roads and observing through high-powered binoculars. Joe called them the shadows, and his face grew dark whenever they appeared. "They serve those who would bottle the sky and sell the stars," the old man said one evening as they watched another SUV make its slow patrol along the property line. "They've caught the scent of power, and they won't stop until they find its source." The spring itself seemed to sense the growing tension. Its glow had become more subtle, as if trying to hide, but its power had only increased. The circle of transformed vegetation was expanding daily, creating an oasis of life in the drought-stricken landscape that was becoming harder and harder to disguise. Lisa's makeshift science station, carefully hidden among the corn, had recorded some startling data. The soil moisture levels near the spring were off the charts, but it wasn't just water content. Something in the liquid was fundamentally altering the cellular structure of everything it touched. She'd watched through her microscope as a drop of the spring water caused a dead plant cell to regenerate, its chloroplasts rebuilding themselves in seconds. "Dad, this isn't just healing water," she whispered one morning, her eyes wide with wonder and fear. "It's like it contains some kind of blueprint for life itself. If the wrong people got hold of this..." She didn't need to finish the thought. Michael had been having nightmares about pharmaceutical companies turning the spring into a factory, or military contractors weaponizing its power. The weight of their secret was becoming almost unbearable. Emma noticed the strain first in the small things, the way Michael's hands shook as he poured his coffee, the dark circles growing under his eyes. He spent his nights patrolling the property with his shotgun and his days trying to maintain the appearance of normal farm operations while coordinating their growing network of lookouts and safeguards. The local community had begun to notice something was different about the Clayton farm. Their nearest neighbor, Tom Bradley, stopped by with a casserole his wife had made, but his eyes kept drifting to the back fields where the corn grew impossibly tall and green. "Heard you're doing some kind of special fertilizer trial," Tom said, carefully, his tone making it clear he didn't quite believe it. "Must be some stuff making crops grow like that in this drought." Michael mumbled something non-committal, but he could feel their carefully constructed cover story beginning to fray. The contrast between his thriving fields and the surrounding farms was becoming too stark to ignore. Joe suggested using his tribal connections to declare the area sacred ground, which would provide some legal protection against trespassing. But that would only draw more attention, exactly what they were trying to avoid. The breaking point came exactly 2 weeks after the spring's appearance. Michael was checking the irrigation pipes near the spring just before dawn when he spotted something that made his blood run cold. Scattered around the perimeter of the transformed area were small electronic devices, blinking with tiny red lights in the pre-dawn gloom. "Sensors," Lisa confirmed after examining one of them. "Environmental monitors, really sophisticated ones. Someone's collecting data about everything that happens here. Soil composition, air quality, radiation levels, you name it." Michael carefully gathered all the devices he could find, but the damage was done. Someone had managed to breach their security, to get close enough to the spring to plant equipment without being detected. Their protective measures weren't enough. That same evening, a black helicopter made 3 low passes over the farm, its sensors clearly scanning the property. When Michael tried to take photos of it, his phone camera mysteriously malfunctioned. Minutes later, all cell service to the farm went dead. "They're tightening the net," Joe said grimly. "Soon they'll make their move." Emma found Michael sitting on the porch steps that night, his shotgun across his knees, staring at the springs. Distant glow. She sat beside him, taking his calloused hand in hers. "Maybe we should just tell everyone," she suggested softly. "Get ahead of it. Control the narrative. Better than waiting for them to take it by force." Michael squeezed her hand, but shook his head. "The moment we go public, we lose any chance of protecting it. You've seen how many different groups are already circling. This isn't just about us anymore." A shooting star streaked across the sky, its trail seeming to linger longer than normal. The spring's water had begun to affect the very air above the farm, creating strange atmospheric phenomena that the weather service had started to notice. They were running out of time, and everyone knew it. The question was no longer if their secret would be discovered, but when, and more importantly, by whom. The crisis struck on a quiet Sunday morning, 3 weeks after the spring's discovery. Michael had just finished his dawn patrol of the property, when his whole body suddenly seized with pain. It started as a dull ache in his chest, then spread like wildfire through his limbs. He collapsed near the barn, his vision blurring as sweat poured down his face. Emma found him there an hour later, semi-conscious and burning with fever. Even in his delirious state, Michael kept mumbling about protecting the spring, trying to get up despite his obvious distress. It took both Emma and Lisa to help him into the house and up to their bedroom. "We need to call an ambulance," Lisa insisted, watching her father's condition deteriorate rapidly. But Emma hesitated, her hand hovering over the phone. Their landline was working again, but they'd discovered their calls were being monitored. If they brought in outside help now, there would be no way to keep their secret. "Call Joe," Michael managed to gasp between waves of pain. "He'll know what to do." The old man arrived within minutes, as if he'd been expecting the call. He took one look at Michael, and his weathered face grew grave. "The water's chosen its guardian," he said quietly. "The land is testing him." "Testing him?" Emma's voice rose with fear and frustration. "He needs a doctor, not riddles." But Joe was already heading back to his truck. He returned with a bundle of herbs and those strange crystalline stones he always carried. "The spring's power is changing everything it touches," he explained as he worked. "Your husband has been spending too much time near it without proper protection. His body is either going to accept the change or reject it." Throughout the day, Michael's condition worsened. His temperature soared to alarming levels, and he drifted in and out of consciousness. When he was awake, he spoke of strange visions, seeing the land as it was hundreds of years ago, feeling the pulse of water deep beneath the earth, understanding the whispered secrets of the corn. The farm itself seemed to reflect his distress. Dark clouds gathered overhead, despite the weather forecast calling for clear skies. The wind picked up, carrying an unusual chill for a summer day. Even the spring's glow became erratic, pulsing like a troubled heartbeat. Lisa maintained her vigil by the window, dividing her attention between her father's sickbed and the driveway. The mysterious observers had become bolder, with black SUVs now parked openly at both ends of their access road. They were watching, waiting, perhaps sensing that something significant was happening. As night fell, the situation reached its breaking point. Michael's fever spiked so high that the thermometer couldn't read it. His skin had taken on a faint bluish tinge, similar to the spring's glow. Emma was beside herself, torn between her husband's immediate medical needs and the larger implications of exposing their secret. "We have to do something," she pleaded with Joe. "We can't just let him die." The old man had been sitting quietly in the corner, threading his crystals onto a leather cord while murmuring prayers in his native tongue. He looked up at Emma's outburst, his eyes reflecting the strange light that now seemed to emanate from Michael's skin. "There is one way," he said slowly, "but it's dangerous. The spring's power is too strong to approach directly in his condition. He needs the water, but in a form his body can accept." Joe explained his plan. They would need to collect water from the spring using one of his ceremonial bowls, then let it sit with the crystals under the light of the moon for precisely 1 hour. The process would dilute the spring's power to a safer level. But there was a problem. The mysterious observers had finally made their move, setting up portable floodlights around the property's perimeter. Men in dark tactical gear could be seen moving through the fields, slowly converging on the spring's location. Getting to the water meant crossing open ground under their surveillance. Lisa stood up, her young face set with determination. "I'll go. I'm smaller and faster, and they might not be watching me as closely." "No," Emma started to protest, but Joe held up his hand. "She's right. And she won't go alone. The spirits of this land remember longer than men. They will help hide her. If her heart is pure." The next hour was the longest of their lives. They watched from the upstairs window as Lisa crept through the darkness, using the cornrows for cover. The tactical teams were getting closer to the spring, their lights sweeping back and forth across the fields. One beam passed within inches of Lisa as she crouched behind a tractor, the ceremonial bowl clutched to her chest. Upstairs, Michael's breathing had become shallow and irregular. Emma held his hand, feeling it alternately burn with fever and turn ice cold. Joe continued his quiet chanting, the crystals in his hands giving off a faint resonance that seemed to match the spring's pulsing glow. When Lisa finally made it back with the water, they followed Joe's instructions precisely. The bowl, filled with the luminescent liquid and surrounded by crystals, was placed on the windowsill in a shaft of moonlight. For 60 tense minutes, they watched as the water's bright blue glow gradually softened to a gentle shimmer. Finally, Joe nodded. The water was ready. The moment it touched Michael's lips, something extraordinary happened. The bluish tinge of his skin intensified briefly, then seemed to sink beneath the surface. His whole body shuddered once, then went completely still. For one terrifying moment, Emma thought they'd lost him. Then Michael's eyes snapped open. They were glowing with the same ethereal blue light as the spring. The transformation in Michael was immediate and profound. As he sat up in bed, his eyes still shimmering with that otherworldly blue light, the air in the room seemed to crackle with energy. Emma and Lisa stood frozen, unsure whether to embrace him or step back, but Joe nodded with quiet satisfaction. "The land has accepted its guardian," the old man said softly. "Now we must gather the others." As if on cue, there was a knock at the front door. Emma went downstairs cautiously, peering through the peephole to find Tom Bradley, their nearest neighbor, standing on the porch with his wife Sarah. Behind them were at least a dozen other local farmers. "We saw the lights," Tom said when Emma opened the door. "And other things. We're here to help." The group filed into the Claytons' living room, the Bradleys, the Hendersons, who had recently sold their farm, old Miss Martha, who ran the seed store, and others who had farmed this valley for generations. Their faces showed a mix of concern and determination. "Those men in black have been watching all our properties," Sarah Bradley explained. "Testing our water, flying drones over our fields. We knew something was happening here, something important." Michael appeared at the top of the stairs, supported by Lisa and Joe. The gathered farmers gasped collectively, not just at his glowing eyes, but at the visible vitality that seemed to radiate from him. He looked decades younger, his previously graying hair now dark and full, his weathered skin smooth and healthy. "It's time they knew the truth," Michael said, his voice carrying a new resonance that filled the room. "With Joe's help," he told them, Everything about finding the spring, its healing powers, and the forces that now sought to control it. As he spoke, something remarkable happened. Each farmer began sharing their own stories, tales passed down through generations about magical waters that appeared in times of great need, about the land's ability to heal itself when given the chance. Miss Martha recalled her grandmother's stories about a glowing spring that had saved the valley's crops during the Dust Bowl. "This land has always had its secrets," Joe added, looking around the room. "And its guardians. But one guardian alone is not enough anymore. The power that flows here now needs all of you." The group quickly organized themselves into teams. The Bradleys, who owned the valley's largest fleet of farm equipment, promised to create confusion by moving machinery all around the area, making it impossible for observers to track normal patterns. Miss Martha would use her seed store as an information hub, monitoring outside inquiries and spreading misleading information. Even the Hendersons, despite having sold their land, pledged their help. "We may not own the acres anymore," Mr. Henderson said, "but our hearts are still here. We'll do whatever it takes." The farmers worked through the night, implementing their plans. They created a complex schedule of patrols, using their intimate knowledge of the land to move unseen through the fields. Regular farm activities would continue as cover, but now each tractor movement, each irrigation check, would be part of a larger strategy to protect the spring. Joe taught them the basic principles of working with the spring's energy, sharing the ancient knowledge that had been passed down through his people. "The water knows," he explained. "It responds to intention, your belief in this land, your connection to it. That's as important as any physical protection we can provide." As dawn approached, Michael stood at his kitchen window, watching the farmers disperse into the early morning mist. The mysterious observers were still out there. He could sense them more clearly now, their presence like dark spots in the land's energy field. But they were no longer facing this challenge alone. Emma came up beside him, slipping her hand into his. "How do you feel?" she asked softly. "Connected," he replied, struggling to find the right words. "Like I can feel every root, every drop of water in the soil. The spring, it's not just healing the land, it's waking it up, reminding it of what it used to be." A fleet of Bradley farm equipment rumbled past their house, creating a dust cloud that would hide the spring's glow from aerial observation. Behind them, Miss Martha's pickup truck headed toward town, ready to begin spreading their carefully crafted cover story. The community had rallied around them, becoming an impromptu army of protectors. Joe was the last to leave, pausing at the door to place one of his crystals in Michael's hand. "Remember," he said, "the water chose you, but it chose this whole, your valley too. What happens next will depend on all of us." For the first time since discovering the spring, the tide began to turn in their favor. The community's coordinated efforts had created a protective bubble around the Clayton farm that was proving remarkably effective. The mysterious observers found themselves constantly misdirected and confused by the seemingly chaotic but carefully orchestrated movements of farm equipment, livestock, and people. Michael's connection to the spring grew stronger each day. He could now sense its energy flowing through the soil, spreading in an intricate web throughout the valley. More remarkably, he could feel when others approached it, their intentions registering like different colors in his mind. Those who came with greed or malice appeared as dark, jarring notes in the spring's harmonious energy field. The transformation in the local landscape was becoming impossible to ignore. Despite the ongoing drought, a radius of approximately 2 miles around the spring had turned remarkably fertile. Crops that had been withering were now flourishing, and the farmers had to deliberately stress some of their plants to avoid drawing even more attention. One morning, Miss Martha burst into the Claytons' kitchen with exciting news. "The university teams have packed up and left," she announced triumphantly. "My contact at the motel says they were frustrated by the inconsistent readings from their equipment. Apparently, every time they thought they'd detected something unusual, it would disappear before they could verify it. This was thanks to an ingenious system developed by Lisa and the Hendersons' teenage son, who had rigged up a network of small irrigation pipes that could quickly dilute any trace of the spring's water in the soil when sensors were detected nearby. The scientific teams had eventually concluded that the unusual satellite readings must have been caused by a temporary atmospheric anomaly. The men in black SUVs proved more persistent, but even they were showing signs of doubt. Their surveillance patterns had become less aggressive, and some of their observation posts had been abandoned. The local sheriff, who was part of their protective network, reported that several of the mysterious vehicles had been seen heading back toward the interstate. "They think they're chasing a ghost story," Tom Bradley said with a grin during one of their evening strategy meetings. "Every lead they follow turns into a dead end. It's hard to justify hanging around when you've got nothing to show for it." But the most remarkable changes were happening to the spring itself. Under Michael's guidance, its power had become more focused and controlled. The obvious glow had dimmed to a subtle shimmer that was only visible to those who knew what to look. For while its healing properties had grown even stronger, Joe spent long hours teaching Michael how to work with the spring's energy. "The water is intelligent," he explained. "It responds to need and intention. By learning to communicate with it, we can help direct its power where it's needed most." They discovered that by placing Joe's crystals in specific patterns, they could create safe channels for the water's energy to flow through the valley's existing irrigation systems. This allowed them to spread its healing properties more widely while maintaining control over who received its full benefits. Emma had started keeping a journal documenting the changes they observed. Wildlife was returning to the valley in unprecedented numbers. Soil that had been depleted by years of intensive farming was regenerating rapidly. Even the air seemed cleaner and more invigorating. Lisa's scientific observations provided the empirical backup to these anecdotal changes. Her careful measurements showed increased oxygen levels in the area, higher nutrient content in the soil, and unexplainable improvements in the cellular structure of every living thing near the spring. The most touching moment came when old Bill, Cooper's prize horse, which had been dying from an incurable illness, made a complete recovery after drinking from a stream that had been subtly enriched with the spring's water. The veterinarian was baffled, but Bill just smiled knowingly and added his own regular patrols to their protection schedule. During a quiet sunset, Michael stood with Emma at the spring's edge, watching the water ripple with its subtle blue luminescence. The transformed cornfield stretched out before them, healthy and vital, but no longer conspicuously different from the surrounding crops. They had learned to modulate its power, to work with it, rather than simply benefit from it. "We're getting better at this," Emma said softly, leaning against him. "The spring, it's like it's teaching us how to be proper stewards of the land again." Michael nodded, feeling the pulse of energy flowing beneath their feet. The spring had chosen well, not just him, but this entire community. They were proving themselves worthy of its gift, using it not for profit or power, but for healing and renewal. Before we continue with this extraordinary story, I want to take a moment to thank all of you who have been following along. If you're enjoying this tale of mystery, healing, and community coming together, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life. Now let's find out what happens next. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Clayton farm as Michael made his usual rounds. The past few days had brought a newfound sense of stability, but with it came a growing awareness that they were approaching a crucial turning point. According to Joe's predictions, They were just days away from the full moon, the moment when the spring's power would reach its peak. The transformation of the valley had become their new normal. The network of farmers had developed an almost supernatural efficiency in their protective duties. Using a combination of traditional farming knowledge and the spring's subtle influence, they had turned their entire community into an invisible fortress. Miss Martha's seed store had become their unofficial headquarters. The old shop's walls, lined with farming supplies and local gossip, now held deeper secrets. Behind the counter, she kept a detailed log of everyone who passed through, noting any suspicious questions or unusual interest in the Clayton property. "It's like the old days," she told Michael one afternoon, her eyes twinkling, "when farmers looked out for each other because they had to. Only now, we're protecting something even more precious than crops." The spring's influence had begun manifesting in unexpected ways. Children in the valley reported having vivid dreams about glowing water and growing things. Local wildlife behaved with uncanny intelligence, often appearing to stand guard around the spring's perimeter. Even the weather seemed to cooperate with their efforts, providing cloud cover when they needed to work unobserved. Lisa had converted her bedroom into a makeshift laboratory, its walls covered with charts tracking the spring's effects. She'd noticed patterns in its energy fluctuations that corresponded with the moon's phases, leading her to believe that something significant would indeed happen during the upcoming full moon. "It's not just the water that's special," she explained to her parents, pointing to her data. "It's like the spring is a focal point for some kind of natural force that's always been here. We just couldn't see it before." The community's protection efforts had evolved into an elaborate dance. The Bradleys' farm equipment moved in carefully choreographed patterns, creating dust clouds that obscured satellite imaging at crucial times. The Henderson kids had developed a system of signals using normal farm activities, the position of a tractor or the timing of irrigation sprinklers, to communicate warnings across the valley. But perhaps most remarkably, the spring seemed to be actively participating in its own concealment. Its visible glow now pulsed in a rhythm that made it virtually invisible to digital cameras, appearing only as lens flare or light pollution in any attempted documentation. Even the few remaining observers from the mysterious organization had been reduced to frustrated inactivity. Their sophisticated equipment consistently failed to produce any concrete evidence, while their agents found themselves inexplicably turned around in the fields, emerging hours later with no clear memory of what they'd been looking for. Joe spent more time at the farm now, teaching Michael to better understand the spring's language. "The water speaks," he would say, "if you learn to listen with more than your ears." Under his guidance, Michael began to recognize patterns in the spring's energy that warned of approaching threats or indicated areas of the land that needed healing. Emma had noticed changes in her husband that went beyond his physical transformation. There was a new depth to him, a connection to the land that manifested in small but significant ways. Plants seemed to lean toward him as he passed. Animals went out of their way to greet him. Even the weather appeared to respond to his moods. The spring's healing influence had spread through the valley's watershed, subtly enriching every stream and well. While its full power remained concentrated at the source, its diluted effects were bringing new vitality to the entire region. Gardens flourished, chronic health conditions mysteriously improved, and a general sense of well-being permeated the community. "We're witnessing something sacred," Joe told them during one of their evening gatherings. "The land is remembering its old power, and it's teaching us to remember too." The night of the full moon arrived with an almost electric tension in the air. Every member of their makeshift guardian community had taken up their positions around the Clayton farm. The spring's glow had intensified to an almost blinding brilliance. its blue light reaching skyward like a beacon. Michael stood at its edge, his own eyes matching its ethereal glow, while Emma, Lisa, and Joe gathered close. The remaining black SUVs had all converged on the property, their occupants finally moving in after weeks of observation. But the valley's protectors were ready. As midnight approached, something extraordinary began to happen. The spring's water started to rise, forming a shimmering column of light that pierced the darkness. Every plant, animal, and person who had been touched by its power felt a deep resonance, a connection that transcended ordinary understanding. "It's time," Joe said softly, removing the ancient crystals from his pouch. "The spring is ready to share its final gift." The mysterious agents watching from the perimeter suddenly found themselves unable to move forward, held back by an invisible force. Instead, they witnessed something that would change their understanding forever. The column of water began to spread, not as liquid but as pure light, covering the entire valley in a gentle blue glow. Within this light, everyone present could see visions of the land's memory, its ancient wisdom, its cycles of healing and renewal, and most importantly, its true purpose. The spring hadn't appeared by chance. It was part of an ancient network of healing sites that awakened in times of great need, when humanity's connection to the earth needed restoration. The Clayton farm had been chosen because of its community's potential to understand and protect. This gift, as the light touched each person present, even the watching agents, they understood. This wasn't about controlling a miraculous water source. It was about learning to be stewards of the land again, about remembering humanity's role in maintaining nature's balance. The spring's physical form began to fade with the coming dawn, but its power didn't disappear. It had transformed, becoming part of the land itself, its healing energy now woven into the very soil of the valley. The water table beneath the entire region had been enriched, blessed with a subtle version of its power that would continue to bring healing and renewal for generations to come. The agents from the mysterious organization found themselves transformed by what they'd witnessed. Instead of trying to control or exploit the spring, they became its unofficial protectors, using their resources to shield the valley from unwanted attention. Michael's role as guardian had evolved too. Though the visible spring was gone, his connection to the land remained, passed down through his family line. The Clayton farm became a subtle sanctuary, a place where those in need could find healing and hope. The community's bonds, forged in their time protecting the spring, grew stronger. The valley flourished, becoming known as a place where crops grew better, where people lived longer, healthier lives, and where the old wisdom of living in harmony with the land was still practiced. Lisa's scientific studies of the spring's effects eventually led her to establish a research center dedicated to understanding and protecting natural healing sites around the world. Emma's detailed records became the foundation for a new approach to land stewardship, teaching others how to recognize and nurture the Earth's natural healing powers. Joe's ancient knowledge found new life in the next generation as young people in the valley grew up understanding the deeper mysteries of the land. The stories of the healing spring became part of local legend, passed down alongside practical wisdom about caring for the earth. Years later, Michael would often sit on his porch at sunset, his eyes still carrying a hint of that otherworldly blue, watching new growth springing from the enriched soil. The visible miracle of the spring had passed, but its true gift remained, a community united in protecting something greater than themselves, and a renewed understanding of humanity's role as guardians rather than exploiters of the Earth's magic. As this story comes to an end, we're reminded that sometimes the greatest miracles aren't in the spectacular moments of transformation, but in the quiet wisdom they leave behind. The healing spring had done more than save a farm. it had awakened an ancient understanding and restored a community's connection to the land that sustained them. What would you do if you discovered something miraculous like this spring? How would you balance the responsibility of protecting it with the desire to share its gifts? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more extraordinary tales of discovery, community, and hope. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey.